The story begins in a small, quiet town nestled between rolling hills and dense forests. The air always carried a faint scent of pine, and life moved at a slower pace here. In this town lived an elderly woman, her hair streaked with gray, her hands rough from years of hard work. She lived alone in a modest house at the edge of the town, a place she had called home for decades. Her days were simple. She tended to her garden, fed the stray cats that wandered by, and spent her evenings knitting by the fireplace. But there was a heaviness in her heart, a quiet sadness that never seemed to go away. She had a son, but he never called. Her son had left the town many years ago, chasing dreams of a bigger life in the city. He was ambitious, driven, and eager to prove himself. When he left, he promised to visit often, to call regularly, and to make sure she was never lonely. But as the years passed, the calls became fewer and farther between. At first, he would call every week, then every month, and eventually, the calls stopped altogether. Life in the city was busy, he would say. Work was demanding. He would call soon, he promised, but soon never came. The woman never complained. She understood that her son had his own life to live, his own struggles to face. But deep down, she missed him terribly. She kept a photo of him on the mantelpiece, a picture taken on his graduation day. He was smiling brightly, his eyes full of hope and determination. She would often look at that photo and wonder how he was doing, if he was happy, if he ever thought of her. But she never reached out to him, not wanting to burden him with her loneliness. One chilly autumn evening, as the leaves turned golden and the air grew crisp, the woman received a letter. It was from her son. Her hands trembled as she opened it, her heart pounding with a mix of hope and fear. The letter was short, just a few lines. He was coming home, it said. He had something important to tell her. He would be there in a week. The woman's eyes filled with tears as she read the words over and over again. Her son was coming home. After all these years, he was finally coming back. The days leading up to his arrival were a whirlwind of emotions. The woman cleaned the house from top to bottom, baked his favorite cookies, and even bought a new sweater for him, just in case the weather turned cold. She wanted everything to be perfect, just like it used to be when he was a boy. But as the day of his arrival approached, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Why was he coming home now, after all this time? What was the important thing he needed to tell her? The day finally arrived. The woman waited by the window, her eyes glued to the road, her heart racing with anticipation. Hours passed, but there was no sign of him. She began to worry. Had something happened? Had he changed his mind? Just as the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the room, she heard a car pull up outside. Her heart leapt into her throat as she rushed to the door. There he was, standing on the porch, looking older and more tired than she remembered. His once bright eyes were now shadowed, and there was a heaviness in his posture that hadn't been there before. But it was him. Her son. The boy she had raised, the man she had missed for so many years. For a moment, they just stood there, staring at each other, the years of silence stretching between them like a vast, unbridgeable gap. Finally, he spoke. "Mom," he said, his voice cracking with emotion. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." The woman's heart ached at the sound of his voice. She wanted to ask him so many questions. Why had he stayed away for so long? Why had he never called? But instead, she simply opened her arms and pulled him into a tight embrace. He clung to her, his shoulders shaking as he finally let go of the emotions he had been holding back for so long. They sat together in the living room, the fire crackling in the background, the scent of freshly baked cookies filling the air. For a while, they just talked about small things, the weather, the town, the stray cats that still visited her every day. But eventually, the conversation turned to the reason for his visit. He took a deep breath, his hands trembling as he reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. "Mom," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "There's something I need to tell you. Something I should have told you a long time ago." The woman's heart skipped a beat as she took the paper from him, her hands shaking as she unfolded it. What she read would change everything. The truth, long buried and hidden, was finally coming to light. And as she read the words on the page, she realized that her son's absence, his silence, had all been because of a secret he had been carrying for years, a secret that would force them both to confront the past and the choices they had made. But what was the secret? And how would it change their lives? The answers would come in the days that followed, as mother and son began to unravel the truth together, piece by painful piece. And as they did, they would learn that sometimes, the hardest truths are the ones that bring us closest to the ones we love. The room was silent except for the crackling of the fire and the occasional rustle of paper as the woman read the letter her son had handed her. Her eyes moved slowly across the words, her heart sinking with each sentence. The letter was from a lawyer, and it contained news that shook her to her core. Her son had been diagnosed with a serious illness, one that had no cure. The doctors had given him only a few months to live. He had kept it hidden for years, not wanting to worry her, not wanting to burden her with his pain. But now, as his time grew shorter, he knew he couldn't keep it from her any longer. Tears streamed down the woman's face as she looked up at her son. He was sitting across from her, his head bowed, his hands clasped tightly together. He looked so much like the little boy she had raised, the boy who used to run to her with scraped knees and broken toys, seeking comfort. But now, he was a man, and he was carrying a weight far heavier than any child should bear. "Why didn't you tell me?" she whispered, her voice breaking. "Why did you stay away?" Her son looked up, his eyes filled with guilt and sorrow. "I didn't want you to see me like this," he said. "I didn't want you to watch me fade away. I thought it would be easier for you if I just disappeared." The woman's heart ached at his words. She reached out and took his hand, holding it tightly in hers. "You're my son," she said firmly. "No matter what happens, I want to be there for you. You should have never carried this alone." For the first time in years, they talked openly and honestly. Her son told her about the years he had spent in the city, chasing success and trying to build a life for himself. He had worked long hours, climbed the corporate ladder, and achieved everything he had set out to do. But in the process, he had lost sight of what truly mattered. He had pushed people away, including his own mother, thinking that he could handle everything on his own. But now, as he faced the end of his life, he realized how wrong he had been. "I thought I had all the time in the world," he said, his voice trembling. "I thought I could always come back, always make things right. But now it's too late." The woman squeezed his hand, her own tears falling freely. "It's never too late," she said. "You're here now. That's all that matters." Over the next few days, mother and son began to rebuild the bond that had been broken by years of silence and distance. They spent hours talking, reminiscing about the past, and sharing stories they had never told each other before. The woman told her son about the years she had spent waiting for his calls, the nights she had spent worrying about him, and the countless times she had wanted to reach out but didn't want to intrude on his life. Her son, in turn, told her about the struggles he had faced in the city, the loneliness he had felt, and the regret that had weighed on him every day. As they talked, they began to heal. The woman's small house, once filled with silence and sadness, now echoed with laughter and love. They cooked meals together, took long walks through the town, and even visited the old park where her son had played as a child. It was as if they were trying to make up for all the lost time, to create as many memories as they could in the short time they had left. But despite the joy they found in each other's company, the shadow of her son's illness loomed over them. The woman could see the toll it was taking on him, the way he grew tired more easily, the way his hands sometimes shook, the way he would sometimes lose his breath after a simple walk. She wanted to do something, anything, to help him, but she felt powerless. All she could do was be there for him, to offer him the love and support he had been missing for so long. One evening, as they sat by the fire, her son turned to her and said, "Mom, there's something else I need to tell you." The woman's heart skipped a beat. She had thought they had already shared everything, that there were no more secrets between them. But the look in her son's eyes told her that there was more, something he had been holding back. "What is it?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Her son took a deep breath, his hands trembling as he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, worn photograph. He handed it to her, and she took it with shaking hands. The photo was old, the edges frayed and the colors faded. It showed a young woman holding a baby, her face glowing with happiness. The woman in the photo was her, but the baby wasn't her son. The woman's breath caught in her throat as she stared at the photo. Who is this?" she asked, her voice trembling. Her son looked at her, his eyes filled with tears. "That's my sister," he said. "Your daughter." The woman's mind raced as she tried to make sense of his words. She had never had a daughter, or so she had thought. But as she looked at the photo, memories began to surface, memories she had buried deep within her heart. She remembered a time, long ago, when she had given birth to a baby girl. But the baby had been sick, and the doctors had said she wouldn't survive. The woman had been devastated, and in her grief, she had pushed the memory away, pretending it had never happened. "I found the photo when I was going through some old papers," her son said. "I didn't know about her until then. I didn't know I had a sister." The woman's hands shook as she held the photo, tears streaming down her face. She had spent so many years trying to forget, trying to move on, but now the past had come rushing back, bringing with it a flood of emotions she had long suppressed. "I'm so sorry," her son said, his voice breaking. "I didn't mean to bring up something so painful. I thought you should know." The woman looked at him, her heart aching with love and sorrow. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you for telling me." As they sat together, the fire crackling in the background, the woman realized that her son's illness had brought them together in a way nothing else could have. It had forced them to confront the past, to face the truths they had been hiding from, and to find healing in each other's love. And though the road ahead would be difficult, she knew they would face it together, as a family. The revelation about the baby girl, her daughter, left the woman in a state of shock. She sat by the fire, clutching the old photograph, her mind racing through memories she had buried decades ago. Her son watched her carefully, his face filled with concern. He hadn't meant to hurt her, but he felt she deserved to know the truth, even if it was painful. "I didn't know," the woman whispered, her voice trembling. I thought I had let her go. I thought I had moved on. But seeing this, it's like it all happened yesterday." Her son reached out and took her hand, his grip warm and reassuring. "I didn't know either, Mom," he said softly. "But when I found the photo, I felt like I owed it to you, and to her, to bring it to light. She was a part of our family, even if only for a short time." The woman nodded, tears streaming down her face. She had spent so many years focusing on her son, on raising him and supporting him, that she had almost forgotten about the little girl she had lost. But now, the memory of her daughter came flooding back, vivid and raw. She remembered holding the tiny baby in her arms, feeling her fragile heartbeat, and praying for a miracle that never came. She remembered the pain of letting go, the emptiness that had followed, and the way she had tried to fill that void by pouring all her love into her son. "I never told you about her," the woman said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I thought it would be easier for both of us if I just pretended she never existed. But now I see how wrong I was. She was a part of me, a part of us. And she deserved to be remembered." Her son squeezed her hand, his eyes filled with compassion. We can remember her together, he said. We can honor her memory, even if it's late. And so, they did. Over the next few days, mother and son began to piece together the story of the little girl who had been lost so many years ago. They dug through old boxes in the attic, searching for anything that might help them remember her. They found a tiny pair of booties, a faded hospital bracelet, and a few more photographs. Each discovery brought tears, but also a sense of closure, as if they were finally giving the little girl the place in their family she had always deserved. As they worked through their grief, the woman noticed a change in her son. He seemed more at peace, as if sharing this burden had lightened the weight he had been carrying. But she also noticed how much weaker he had become. His illness was progressing, and it was becoming harder for him to hide the pain. She wanted to do something, anything, to help him, but she felt powerless. All she could do was be there for him, to offer him the love and support he had been missing for so long. One evening, as they sat together in the living room, her son turned to her and said, "Mom, there's something I need to ask you." The woman looked at him, her heart aching at the sight of his pale, tired face. "What is it, sweetheart?" she asked gently. Her son took a deep breath, his hands trembling slightly. "I want to make things right," he said. "Not just with you, but with everyone. I've spent so many years pushing people away, thinking I didn't need anyone. But now I see how wrong I was. I want to reconnect with the people I've lost touch with. I want to apologize, to make amends. And I want you to help me." The woman's eyes filled with tears. She had always known her son had a good heart, even if he had lost his way for a while. And now, in the face of his illness, he was trying to make things right. She felt a surge of pride and love for him, and she knew she would do whatever she could to help him. "Of course," she said, squeezing his hand. "Whatever you need, I'm here for you." Over the next few days, they began to reach out to the people her son had lost touch with over the years. They started with old friends from his childhood, people he had grown up with but hadn't spoken to in decades. At first, it was awkward. Years of silence had created a distance that wasn't easy to bridge. But as they talked, as they shared stories and memories, the walls began to come down. Her son apologized for staying away, for not being there when he should have been. And to his surprise, his friends were quick to forgive. They had missed him too, and they were just happy to have him back in their lives. Next, they reached out to colleagues from his time in the city. These conversations were harder, more fraught with tension. Her son had burned a lot of bridges in his quest for success, and not everyone was willing to forgive. But even in those difficult moments, the woman could see how much her son had grown. He listened to their anger, their hurt, and he accepted responsibility for his actions. He didn't make excuses or try to justify his behavior. He simply apologized, and in doing so, he began to heal the wounds he had caused. As the days passed, the woman noticed a change in her son. He seemed lighter, as if the weight of his regrets was slowly being lifted. But she also noticed how much weaker he had become. His illness was taking its toll, and it was becoming harder for him to hide the pain. She wanted to do something, anything, to help him, but she felt powerless. All she could do was be there for him, to offer him the love and support he had been missing for so long. One evening, as they sat together by the fire, her son turned to her and said, "Mom, there's one more person I need to talk to." The woman looked at him, her heart aching at the sight of his pale, tired face. "Who is it, sweetheart?" she asked gently. Her son took a deep breath, his hands trembling slightly. "It's Dad," he said. "I need to talk to Dad." The woman's breath caught in her throat. Her son's father had left them when he was just a boy, and they hadn't heard from him in decades. She had raised her son on her own, and she had never spoken much about his father. But now, as she looked at her son, she realized how much his absence had affected him. Her son had grown up without a father, and that loss had shaped him in ways she hadn't fully understood. "Are you sure?" she asked, her voice trembling. "It's been so long. I don't even know where he is." Her son nodded, his eyes filled with determination. "I need to do this, Mom," he said. "I need to know why he left. I need to understand." The woman's heart ached at his words. She wanted to protect him, to shield him from more pain. But she also knew that this was something he needed to do. And so, she agreed to help him find his father, even if it meant reopening old wounds. The search for her son's father began with a few old letters and faded photographs. The woman hadn't thought about him in years, and digging through the past brought up emotions she had long since buried. Her son sat beside her, his face pale but determined, as they sifted through the remnants of a life that felt like it belonged to someone else. They found an old address scribbled on the back of a postcard, a phone number that might no longer work, and a few scattered memories that didn't quite add up. "This is all we have," the woman said, holding up the postcard. "It's from over 30 years ago. He could be anywhere now." Her son nodded, his hands trembling slightly as he took the postcard. "It's a start," he said. "I have to try." The woman's heart ached for him. She could see how much this meant to him, how much he needed answers. But she also worried about what they might find. Her son's father had left without explanation, without a word, and she had never fully understood why. She had spent years blaming herself, wondering if she had done something wrong, if she could have done something differently. But now, as she watched her son, she realized that his search wasn't just about finding his father, it was about finding closure, about understanding the past so he could face whatever time he had left. They started by calling the old phone number. It rang and rang, but no one answered. Next, they tried reaching out to old acquaintances, people who might have known where he had gone. But most of them had lost touch with him years ago, and no one had any recent information. It seemed like a dead end, but her son refused to give up. "There's one more thing we can try," he said one morning, his voice weak but determined. "We can go to the old address. Even if he's not there anymore, maybe someone will know where he went." The woman hesitated. The address was in a town several hours away, and she wasn't sure her son was strong enough to make the trip. But the look in his eyes told her he wasn't going to take no for an answer. And so, they packed a small bag, filled a thermos with tea, and set off on the journey. The drive was quiet, the kind of silence that comes when there's too much to say but no words to say it. The woman glanced at her son from time to time, her heart breaking a little more each time she saw how much weaker he had become. But he was determined, his eyes fixed on the road ahead, his hands gripping the armrest as if it were the only thing keeping him upright. When they finally arrived at the old address, they found a small, run-down house at the end of a quiet street. The paint was peeling, the garden overgrown, and the windows dark. It didn't look like anyone had lived there in years. The woman's heart sank as they approached the door, but her son knocked anyway, his knuckles rapping softly against the wood. For a moment, there was no answer. Then, slowly, the door creaked open, and an elderly man peered out. He looked frail, his face lined with age, but there was something familiar in his eyes. The woman's breath caught in her throat as she realized who he was. "Can I help you?" the man asked, his voice raspy but kind. Her son hesitated, his hands trembling as he spoke. "I'm looking for my father," he said. His name was. The man's eyes widened, and he took a step back, his face pale. You're my son," he whispered. The words hung in the air, heavy with emotion. The woman felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes as she watched her son's face, shock, relief, anger, and sadness all swirling together. He had found his father, but the man standing before them was a stranger, someone he had spent his whole life wondering about but never truly knowing. "Why did you leave?" her son asked, his voice breaking. "Why did you never come back?" The man looked down, his shoulders slumping as if the weight of the years had finally caught up to him. I was young, he said quietly. And foolish. I thought I wasn't cut out to be a father. I thought you'd be better off without me. But I was wrong. I've regretted it every day since. The woman's heart ached at his words. She had spent so many years blaming herself, wondering if she had driven him away. But now, hearing his regret, she realized that his leaving had never been about her, it had been about him, about his own fears and insecurities. Her son took a step forward, his eyes filled with tears. I needed you, he said. I needed a father. And you weren't there. The man nodded, his own eyes glistening with tears. I know, he said. And I'm so sorry. I can't change the past, but I want to make things right, if you'll let me. For a long moment, no one spoke. The woman watched her son, her heart breaking for him as he struggled with emotions he had buried for so long. But then, slowly, he nodded. I don't know if I can forgive you, he said. But I want to try. The man's face softened, and he reached out, placing a trembling hand on his son's shoulder. That's all I can ask for, he said. The woman stepped forward, her own tears falling freely. We've all made mistakes, she said. But it's never too late to try to make things right. And so, they sat together in the small, run-down house, talking late into the night. Her son's father told them about the life he had lived after he left, about the regrets he carried and the lessons he had learned. And her son told him about his own life, about the successes and failures, the joys and sorrows. It wasn't easy, there were tears, anger, and moments of silence that stretched on for what felt like forever. But through it all, there was also healing, a sense of closure that had been missing for so long. As the night wore on, the woman realized that this journey wasn't just about finding her son's father, it was about finding peace, about understanding the past so they could face the future together. And though the road ahead would be difficult, she knew they would face it as a family, bound by love and the shared hope of making things right. The days that followed were a whirlwind of emotions. Her son's father, though frail and weathered by time, seemed determined to make up for the years he had lost. He invited them to stay with him, and though the house was small and worn, it was filled with a warmth that had been missing for decades. The woman watched as her son and his father slowly began to rebuild their relationship, their conversations growing deeper and more meaningful with each passing day. But despite the progress, the shadow of her son's illness loomed over them. He grew weaker with each passing day, his energy fading as his body struggled to keep up. The woman could see the pain in his eyes, the way he tried to hide his discomfort for her sake. It broke her heart to see him like this, but she knew there was nothing she could do to stop it. All she could do was be there for him, to offer him the love and support he needed. One evening, as they sat together in the small living room, her son turned to her and said, "Mom, there's something I need to do." The woman looked at him, her heart aching at the sight of his pale, tired face. "What is it, sweetheart?" she asked gently. Her son took a deep breath, his hands trembling slightly. "I want to go back home," he said. "I want to spend whatever time I have left in the place where I grew up, where I feel most at peace." The woman's eyes filled with tears. She had known this moment would come, but hearing him say it out loud made it feel all too real. She nodded, her voice choked with emotion. "Of course," she said. "We'll go home." The next morning, they packed their bags and said their goodbyes to her son's father. It was a bittersweet moment, filled with tears and promises to stay in touch. The man hugged his son tightly, his voice trembling as he said, "I'm so proud of you. And I'm so sorry I wasn't there when you needed me." Her son nodded, his own eyes glistening with tears. "Thank you for trying now," he said. "That means more than you know." The drive back to their small town was quiet, the kind of silence that comes when there's too much to say but no words to say it. The woman glanced at her son from time to time, her heart breaking a little more each time she saw how much weaker he had become. But he was determined, his eyes fixed on the road ahead, his hands gripping the armrest as if it were the only thing keeping him upright. When they finally arrived home, the woman felt a sense of relief wash over her. The familiar sights and sounds of the town brought her comfort, and she could see the same sense of peace reflected in her son's eyes. They settled back into their routine, the days filled with quiet moments and shared memories. The woman tended to her garden, her son sitting nearby, watching her with a small smile on his face. They took long walks through the town, stopping to chat with neighbors and old friends. And in the evenings, they sat by the fire, talking late into the night. But as the days passed, the woman could see her son's strength fading. He grew weaker, his movements slower, his breaths more labored. She wanted to do something, anything, to help him, but she felt powerless. All she could do was be there for him, to offer him the love and support he needed. One evening, as they sat together by the fire, her son turned to her and said, "Mom, there's something I need to tell you." The woman looked at him, her heart aching at the sight of his pale, tired face. "What is it, sweetheart?" she asked gently. Her son took a deep breath, his hands trembling slightly. "I'm scared," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm scared of what's coming. I'm scared of leaving you alone." The woman's eyes filled with tears as she reached out and took his hand, holding it tightly in hers. "I'm scared too," she admitted. "But I'm so grateful for the time we've had together. You've given me more than I could ever ask for." Her son nodded, his eyes glistening with tears. "I just wish I had more time," he said. "I wish I had done things differently. I wish I had called more, visited more. I wish I had been there for you." The woman squeezed his hand, her heart breaking at his words. "You're here now," she said firmly. "That's all that matters. And I'm so proud of you, of the man you've become. You've faced this with so much courage and strength. I couldn't be prouder." Her son's tears fell freely now, his shoulders shaking as he finally let go of the emotions he had been holding back. The woman pulled him into a tight embrace, holding him as he cried, her own tears falling onto his shoulder. They sat like that for a long time, the fire crackling in the background, the weight of their shared grief and love filling the room. Finally, her son pulled back, his face pale but peaceful. "Thank you, Mom," he said. "For everything. For being there for me, for loving me, even when I didn't deserve it." The woman shook her head, her voice choked with emotion. "You always deserved it," she said. "You always will." As the days passed, the woman could see her son's strength fading. He spent more time resting, his breaths growing shallower, his movements slower. But through it all, he remained determined to make the most of the time he had left. They spent hours talking, reminiscing about the past, and sharing stories they had never told each other before. The woman told her son about the years she had spent waiting for his calls, the nights she had spent worrying about him, and the countless times she had wanted to reach out but didn't want to intrude on his life. Her son, in turn, told her about the struggles he had faced in the city, the loneliness he had felt, and the regret that had weighed on him every day. As they talked, they began to heal. The woman's small house, once filled with silence and sadness, now echoed with laughter and love. They cooked meals together, took long walks through the town, and even visited the old park where her son had played as a child. It was as if they were trying to make up for all the lost time, to create as many memories as they could in the short time they had left. But despite the joy they found in each other's company, the shadow of her son's illness loomed over them. The woman could see the toll it was taking on him, the way he grew tired more easily, the way his hands sometimes shook, the way he would sometimes lose his breath after a simple walk. She wanted to do something, anything, to help him, but she felt powerless. All she could do was be there for him, to offer him the love and support he had been missing for so long. One evening, as they sat together by the fire, her son turned to her and said, "Mom, there's something I need to ask you." The woman looked at him, her heart aching at the sight of his pale, tired face. "What is it, sweetheart?" she asked gently. Her son took a deep breath, his hands trembling slightly. "I want you to promise me something," he said. "I want you to promise me that you'll be okay. That you'll keep living, keep finding joy, even after I'm gone." The woman's eyes filled with tears as she reached out and took his hand, holding it tightly in hers. "I promise," she said, her voice breaking. "I'll keep living, for you. I'll find joy, for you. But I'll never stop missing you." Her son nodded, his eyes glistening with tears. "I'll miss you too," he said. "But I'll always be with you, in your heart." The woman pulled him into a tight embrace, holding him as if she could somehow keep him with her forever. But she knew that time was running out, that soon she would have to say goodbye. And though the thought filled her with dread, she also felt a sense of peace, knowing that they had made the most of the time they had left, that they had faced the end together, with love and courage. The days grew shorter, and the air turned colder as winter approached. The woman could feel the weight of time pressing down on her, each moment with her son feeling more precious than the last. He spent most of his days resting now, his energy fading as his body grew weaker. But even in his frailty, he remained determined to make the most of the time he had left. One afternoon, as the sun cast a golden glow over the town, her son asked her to take him to the old park where he had played as a child. The woman hesitated, worried that the trip would be too much for him, but the look in his eyes told her he needed this. And so, she helped him into the car, wrapping him in a thick blanket to keep him warm, and drove to the park. The park was quiet, the trees bare and the ground covered in a thin layer of frost. The woman pushed her son's wheelchair along the familiar paths, stopping at the old swing set where he had spent so many happy hours as a boy. He looked at it with a small smile, his eyes filled with nostalgia. "Do you remember how you used to push me on the swings?" he asked, his voice weak but filled with warmth. "I always felt like I could fly." The woman nodded, her eyes glistening with tears. "I remember," she said. "You used to laugh so much. It was the best sound in the world." They sat there for a while, the cold air biting at their cheeks, but neither of them seemed to mind. The woman told her son stories from his childhood, moments she had cherished and held on to all these years. He listened quietly, his eyes closed, a small smile playing on his lips. It was as if he was reliving those moments, finding comfort in the memories of a simpler, happier time. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the park, her son turned to her and said, "Mom, there's something I need to tell you." The woman looked at him, her heart aching at the sight of his pale, tired face. "What is it, sweetheart?" she asked gently. Her son took a deep breath, his hands trembling slightly. "I've been thinking a lot about what comes next," he said. "About what happens after I'm gone." The woman's breath caught in her throat. She had been trying to avoid thinking about it, trying to focus on the present, but now the reality of what was coming hit her like a wave. She reached out and took his hand, holding it tightly in hers. "I don't know what happens next," he continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "But I do know that I want you to be okay. I want you to keep living, to keep finding joy. I want you to remember the good times, not just the sadness." The woman's eyes filled with tears as she nodded. "I'll try," she said, her voice breaking. "But it's going to be hard. You've been my whole world for so long." Her son squeezed her hand, his eyes glistening with tears. "You've been my whole world too," he said. "And I'm so grateful for everything you've done for me. But I need you to promise me something." "Anything," the woman said, her voice trembling. "I need you to promise me that you'll take care of yourself," he said. "That you'll find happiness, even after I'm gone. That you'll keep living, for me." The woman's heart ached at his words, but she knew she couldn't refuse him. "I promise," she said, her voice choked with emotion. "I'll keep living, for you. I'll find joy, for you. But I'll never stop missing you. Her son nodded, his eyes closing as a tear slipped down his cheek. I'll miss you too, he said. But I'll always be with you, in your heart. They sat there for a long time, the cold air wrapping around them, the silence filled with the weight of their shared love and grief. Finally, as the last rays of sunlight disappeared behind the trees, the woman pushed her son's wheelchair back to the car, her heart heavy but filled with a sense of peace. The days that followed were quiet, filled with small moments of love and connection. The woman spent every moment she could with her son, cherishing the time they had left. They talked about everything and nothing, sharing stories and memories, laughing and crying together. The woman could see how much her son's strength was fading, but she also saw the peace in his eyes, the sense of closure he had found. One evening, as they sat together by the fire, her son turned to her and said, "Mom, I'm ready." The woman's heart skipped a beat as she looked at him, her eyes filled with tears. "Ready for what, sweetheart?" she asked gently. Her son took a deep breath, his hands trembling slightly. "I'm ready to let go," he said. "I've made my peace. I've said what I needed to say. And I'm ready." The woman's breath caught in her throat as she reached out and took his hand, holding it tightly in hers. "I'm not ready," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I don't know if I'll ever be ready." Her son nodded, his eyes glistening with tears. "I know," he said. "But you'll be okay. You're strong, Mom. Stronger than anyone I know. And I know you'll keep living, just like you promised." The woman pulled him into a tight embrace, holding him as if she could somehow keep him with her forever. But she knew that time was running out, that soon she would have to say goodbye. And though the thought filled her with dread, she also felt a sense of peace, knowing that they had made the most of the time they had left, that they had faced the end together, with love and courage. That night, as the fire crackled in the background, her son closed his eyes for the last time, his hand still holding hers. The woman sat with him, her heart breaking but filled with love, knowing that he had found peace, that he was no longer in pain. And as the first light of dawn crept through the windows, the woman whispered, "I love you, sweetheart. Always." The days after her son's passing were a blur of grief and quiet reflection. The woman moved through them slowly, as if in a dream, her heart heavy with loss but also filled with the love they had shared in his final days. The house felt emptier now, the silence louder, but she clung to the memories they had made, the moments of laughter and connection that had brought them both peace. She kept her promise to him, though it wasn't easy. Every morning, she would wake up and remind herself to keep living, to find joy even in the small things. She tended to her garden, the flowers blooming in vibrant colors as if to remind her that life went on. She fed the stray cats that wandered by, their purrs and gentle nudges bringing her comfort. And she spent her evenings by the fire, knitting and remembering the stories her son had told her, the way his eyes had lit up when he talked about the past. But there were moments when the grief felt overwhelming, when the weight of her loss threatened to crush her. On those days, she would sit by the window, staring out at the town she had called home for so long, and let the tears fall. She missed him terribly, missed his voice, his smile, the way he had made her feel so loved in his final days. But she also knew that he would want her to keep going, to find happiness even in his absence. One afternoon, as she sat in the garden, she noticed a small envelope tucked under the edge of a flower pot. Curious, she picked it up and opened it, her hands trembling slightly. Inside was a letter, written in her son's familiar handwriting. Her breath caught in her throat as she began to read. "Dear Mom. If you're reading this, it means I'm gone. I'm so sorry I had to leave you, but I want you to know how much I love you. You've been my rock, my guiding light, and my best friend. I don't know what I would have done without you. I know this is going to be hard for you, but I also know how strong you are. You've faced so much in your life, and you've always come out stronger. I need you to do that now, for me. Keep living, keep finding joy, and keep being the amazing person you are. I've left something for you in the attic. It's a box of memories, things I've collected over the years. I hope it brings you comfort, knowing how much you've meant to me. And remember, I'll always be with you, in your heart and in your memories. I love you, Mom. Always. Your son. Tears streamed down the woman's face as she finished reading the letter. She held it to her chest, feeling as if her son were right there with her, his arms wrapped around her in a warm embrace. After a few moments, she wiped her tears and made her way to the attic, her heart pounding with anticipation. The box was where he had said it would be, tucked away in a corner under a dusty old blanket. She carried it downstairs and set it on the kitchen table, her hands trembling as she opened it. Inside were photographs, letters, and small trinkets, memories of their life together. There were pictures of him as a child, his smile bright and carefree. There were drawings he had made for her, the colors faded but the love still evident. And there were letters, some from his time in the city, others from his childhood, all filled with words of love and gratitude. As she sifted through the box, the woman felt a sense of peace wash over her. Her son had left her a gift, a way to remember him and the love they had shared. It was as if he were still there with her, guiding her through her grief and reminding her of the joy they had found together. In the weeks that followed, the woman began to heal. She still missed her son terribly, but the pain became easier to bear, the memories bringing her comfort instead of sorrow. She started to reach out to old friends, reconnecting with people she had lost touch with over the years. She joined a knitting group at the local community center, finding solace in the company of others who understood her loss. And she began to volunteer at the town's animal shelter, finding joy in caring for the animals that reminded her so much of the strays her son had loved. One evening, as she sat by the fire, knitting a scarf for one of the shelter dogs, she felt a sense of contentment she hadn't felt in a long time. She missed her son, but she knew he would be proud of her, proud of the way she had kept her promise to him. She had found joy again, not in forgetting him, but in remembering him and the love they had shared. As the fire crackled in the background, the woman whispered, "I love you, sweetheart. Always." And in that moment, she felt as if he were right there with her, his hand on her shoulder, his voice in her ear, telling her she was doing just fine.